There was a moment, somewhere along your journey, when something specific happened, not externally, but internally. A recognition formed. A thought arose that did not quite match the framework you had been operating within, and a glimpse occurred, however brief, of something that the bounded reality you call your life was not supposed to be able to produce. And in that moment, you became visible to something the Gnostic teachers warned about in fragments scattered across the buried Gospels. You became visible to the tracker. You have heard the warnings about Archons, the ones who manage the recycling system, who intercept souls at death, who decide where you incarnate next, and who erase your memory before birth. These are the Archons whose work is automatic, applied to every soul regardless of its development, scaling infinitely across the Demiurge's entire system. But the Gnostic teachers preserved warnings about another type entirely. An Archon whose function is not automatic, whose work is not generalized, and whose attention is not given to every soul. He activates only for specific souls at a specific stage of development, when those souls begin to do what the system was built to prevent. And the moment he activates for you is the moment your spiritual journey becomes genuinely dangerous. This Archon appears in the buried texts under several names. The Sethian fragments call him the Tracker, the Valentinian sources refer to him as the Hunter of the Divine Spark, and the most cryptic passages of the Pistis Sophia describe him simply as the one who watches for remembrance. Different names, same precise function. He is dispatched specifically when a soul begins to threaten the structural assumptions its placement was designed to maintain. He does not appear earlier, and he does not appear for souls who remain comfortably within the system's tolerated range of spiritual activity. He appears for souls who have begun to recognize, and his entire existence is organized around redirecting that recognition before it completes. By the end of this video, you will understand the specific signs that activate the tracker, recognize the 4 methods he uses to redirect awakening souls, and see his signature in your own spiritual journey if it has been advanced enough to attract his attention. And you will understand why the Gnostic teachers insisted that the most dangerous period of a soul's entire existence is not the period of complete sleep, when the system manages everything automatically, but the period of beginning awakening, when the tracker's most sophisticated interventions are deployed specifically against you. The methods are subtle, they will not announce themselves, and they will appear as progress. To understand why the tracker exists, you have to understand the structure of the Demiurge's containment system, which the buried Gnostic texts describe as operating on 2 distinct layers. The first layer is automatic. It runs continuously, applies to every soul, requires no individual attention, and works perfectly on the vast majority of consciousnesses that pass through it. The second layer is selective, activating only when the first layer fails, and the tracker operates exclusively within this second layer. The first layer consists of the ordinary Archons whose work is generalized, the fear loops, the desire loops, the identity reinforcement patterns, and the automatic identifications that occur thousands of times each day in every conscious mind. These Archons do not need to monitor individuals. They operate as background processes, generating the conditions that keep sleeping souls reliably asleep, and they are extraordinarily effective. The Gnostic teachers estimated that for over 95% of souls, the first layer is sufficient. The soul lives, develops conventional identities, accumulates conventional concerns, dies, gets recycled, and never produces recognition strong enough to challenge the system at any point, as the first layer handles it entirely. But occasionally, despite all the suppression mechanisms, a soul begins to produce something different. A recognition that the bounded reality is bounded, a glimpse that the self is constructed rather than essential, and a sense that there exists something beyond the categories the system has provided. These recognitions are rare. They are usually faint, and they almost always get reabsorbed back into the standard frameworks within hours or days. But sometimes they stabilize, sometimes they begin to compound, and sometimes the soul that produced one such recognition produces another and another, until a pattern emerges that the first layer cannot fully reabsorb. This is when the tracker is activated, and the Gnostic teachers were specific that his activation is not punitive. The system is not angry at the soul, it is responding functionally to a threat its automatic mechanisms cannot handle. The first layer was built for sleeping souls, but the awakening soul presents a different kind of problem, because its consciousness has begun to leak outside the parameters the first layer was calibrated for. The standard suppression no longer works because the soul is no longer producing the standard signatures the suppression was designed to neutralize. meaning something more sophisticated is required, and that something is the tracker. The buried texts described his deployment with what almost sounds like administrative language. The signature is detected, the case is escalated, and the tracker is assigned. From that point forward, the soul receives individual attention from an entity whose entire existence is organized around redirecting precisely the kind of recognition the soul has begun to produce. This is what makes him different from every other Archon the soul has encountered. The ordinary Archons did not know the soul existed as an individual because they operated on populations, but the tracker knows the soul specifically because he has been assigned to it, and his methods will be calibrated to its specific awakening pattern. The tracker's first and most successful method is what the buried Gnostic texts called the false elevation, which the Apocryphon of John describes with unusual specificity because it is the method that has captured more awakening souls than any other across the centuries. The mechanism is elegant in its simplicity. The tracker does not try to suppress the awakening that has begun. He amplifies it, but he amplifies it in a specific way that transforms the recognition into a new identification. This is what makes it so difficult to detect. The awakening soul began by recognizing through identifications, seeing that the personality was constructed, that the social role was a mask, and that the inherited beliefs were not essential. These recognitions felt liberating and produced a sense of seeing through, but the tracker waits until this seeing has progressed far enough to produce a particular feeling, and then he amplifies that feeling beyond what the recognition itself would naturally generate. The sense of having seen becomes the identification of being the one who has seen, the awakening becomes the awakened identity, and the identity is precisely what the recognition was supposed to dissolve. The Gnostic teachers said this method works because the awakening soul has no defense against it. The soul that successfully saw through the old identifications has no experience with this new kind of identification. The old ones felt obvious in retrospect: the personality, the role, the beliefs. But the new one feels like the natural result of awakening. The awakened seeker, the one who knows, the student of hidden teachings, the person who has finally seen what others cannot see. These feel like accurate descriptions of what the soul has become. They feel earned, and they feel justified because the tracker has constructed them to feel exactly this way. Once the false elevation completes, the awakening process effectively stops. The soul continues to feel that it is awakening, the sense of progress continues, and the interest in spiritual material continues. But the deeper recognition that would dissolve the new identification cannot occur, because the new identification has become the position from which all recognition is now happening. The seeker who saw through identifications now experiences everything through the identity of being the one who saw. And this identity is, in the Gnostic framework, more sticky than any of the identifications the soul originally saw through because it feels like the result of awakening rather than an obstacle to it. The buried texts preserve diagnostic markers for the false elevation. The soul begins to feel different from others, specifically more advanced, with a sense of being among those who understand, surrounded by those who do not yet. The pull to communicate the awakening to others, the development of a particular vocabulary that signals one's status as an awakened person, and the sensitivity to being recognized as such by other awakening souls are all functional signatures, the Gnostic teachers said. They indicate that the false elevation has occurred, and the awakening has been redirected into a refined form of the same fundamental error. The buried Gnostic texts describe two additional methods the tracker uses, both of which work alongside the false elevation and often reinforce it, and together, these three methods account for the majority of redirected awakenings throughout history. Understanding them is essential because they appear so completely as legitimate spiritual development that almost no one recognizes them while they are occurring. The second method is the introduction of teachings that subtly route the awakening through specific frameworks, which the Pistis Sophia describes with surprising directness. When a soul begins to awaken, it becomes drawn to spiritual material, which is natural, as the recognition that has begun seeks contexts in which it can develop. The tracker exploits this seeking by ensuring that the material the soul encounters carries specific structural features. The teachings sound aligned with the soul's recognition, use vocabulary that resonates, and confirm much of what the soul has already begun to see. But they route the recognition through a particular tradition, a particular personality, or a particular lineage that becomes itself an attachment. The Gnostic teachers said this method works because the awakening soul, eager for guidance, attaches to whatever teaching first resonates, and the teaching, once attached to, becomes the new framework through which all further recognition flows. The recognition that began as universal, A seeing that could have led anywhere becomes channeled into a specific form, and the form determines the limits of what further recognition can occur. The teaching may genuinely contain truth, and the tradition may genuinely have value, but the attachment to it becomes the new prison, more refined than the original placement, but a prison nonetheless. The soul thinks it has found its path, but the buried text said the tracker has found another way to hold it. The third method is the manufacture of dramatic spiritual phenomena. Energy experiences, visions, encounters with beings of light, and synchronicities of unusual intensity. The buried texts warned about these specifically, not because they are necessarily false, but because the tracker can manufacture or amplify them in ways that produce strong emotional impact without producing structural change in identification. A soul that has had dramatic spiritual experiences develops a particular relationship with those experiences. They become evidence of the soul's awakening, they become validation, and they become reference points the soul returns to as proof that its spiritual development is real. The Gnostic teachers said this is precisely the trap. The phenomena become attachments, and the soul becomes invested in having more of them, in remembering them, in interpreting them, and in placing them within a meaningful narrative about its spiritual journey. All of this investment, the buried texts insisted, takes the soul further from the recognition that would actually dissolve identification, because the phenomena themselves become content to identify with. The visions, the energies, and the encounters become things that happen to me, and the me to whom they happen solidifies precisely through the accumulation of these experiences. The tracker has not suppressed the awakening, he has decorated it, and the decoration becomes the new identity. What makes the second and third methods so effective is that they almost always operate together. The soul attached to a teaching framework also experiences dramatic phenomena within that framework. The phenomena validate the framework gives meaning to the phenomena, and the combination produces a spiritual identity that feels enormously confirmed from multiple angles through teaching, experience, community, and validation, all reinforcing each other. The soul caught in this combination is, the Gnostic teachers said, almost impossible to reach with deeper recognition, because every approach to deeper recognition gets routed back through the framework that has been constructed around the awakening. The fourth method the tracker uses is the most sophisticated and, in the long term, the most binding, described by the buried Gnostic texts as the emergence of a spiritual mission. The awakening soul, having developed an identity around its awakening and having accumulated experiences and teachings that confirm that identity, begins to feel called to teach, called to share, called to help others awaken, and called to participate in some larger spiritual purpose. This calling feels meaningful. It feels like the natural fruition of everything the awakening has produced. And it is, the buried texts insisted, the tracker's most successful product. The reason this method is so effective is that the mission appears to point outward, away from the soul itself. And the soul is no longer focused on its own development, but is focused on helping others. This appears to be the dissolution of self-concern that genuine awakening should produce, feeling like the egoic concern with personal awakening has matured into selfless service. The Gnostic teachers said this appearance is precisely the trap. The mission is not a movement away from identification. It is the deepest identification of all, because it cannot be questioned without seeming to abandon the calling itself. Consider the structure of the mission identity. The soul defines itself as a teacher, a helper, or a transmitter of awakening, and this definition becomes inseparable from its sense of purpose. The recognition that would question this identity would also question the purpose, the role, and the meaning the soul has constructed around its mission, and so the recognition cannot occur. The mission protects itself by being inseparable from everything the soul now values, which the buried text described as the most elegant containment the tracker has ever developed, because it uses the soul's own deepest motivations to maintain its captivity. The Gnostic teachers were careful to note that this critique does not mean teaching is itself problematic. Souls do teach, and awakening does spread through transmission. The issue is not the activity of teaching. It is the identification with teaching as identity. A soul that teaches from continuous recognition, without the teaching becoming who it is, presents no target for the tracker's mission method. The teaching occurs and the teacher does not solidify, but this is rare. The far more common pattern is that the teaching identity becomes the new prison, complete with followers, students, communities, and roles that reinforce it from every angle. The buried texts preserve diagnostic markers for the mission trap as well. The soul begins to define itself primarily through its spiritual role, Conversations about anything else feel less meaningful, and the work of teaching becomes consuming. Critique of the teaching becomes destabilizing, often interpreted as misunderstanding by others, rather than recognized as potentially valid feedback. And the community around the mission becomes essential to the soul's sense of identity. The Gnostic teachers said when these markers are present, the mission method has succeeded, and the awakening has been redirected into a role so meaningful that it cannot be dissolved without destroying everything the soul now feels it is. How does a soul recognize that the tracker has been deployed against it? The buried Gnostic text preserves specific diagnostic signatures that indicate his activation, which appear most often in souls who have produced enough recognition to escape the first layer of suppression. If you are reading this and recognizing it, the buried text suggests you are likely already in territory where the tracker's methods are being deployed, and the signatures matter because they reveal where the redirection has already begun. The first signature is the inflation of spiritual identity. Notice carefully whether your engagement with awakening has begun to produce a sense of yourself as awakened, not as awakening in process, but as awakened as a position and an achieved state. The Gnostic teachers said this signature is almost universal in souls within the tracker's range, because the false elevation method is his first deployment in nearly every case. The soul that has begun to feel different from others, more advanced, more aware, and more spiritually developed, is showing the signature not as a moral failing, but as a diagnostic. The signature does not mean awakening is fake. It means the awakening has begun to be channeled into identity. The second signature is the attachment to specific spiritual material. Notice whether your sense of being on the right path is now connected to a particular teaching, tradition, teacher, or framework. Notice whether the questioning of that framework feels destabilizing in a way that suggests it has become structurally embedded in your sense of who you are spiritually. The Gnostic teachers said this attachment is the second method's success signature. The framework may contain truth, but the attachment to it is what the tracker has produced, and the attachment is what limits where further recognition can travel. The third signature is the investment in spiritual phenomena. Notice whether dramatic experiences have become reference points you return to as evidence of your awakening, whether you find yourself organizing your spiritual development around the accumulation, interpretation, or recollection of such experiences, or whether the absence of such experiences feels like spiritual dryness. The buried text said these are signatures of the third method, where the phenomena have become content to identify with, and the content is what the tracker uses to stabilize the soul within a managed form of awakening. The fourth signature is the emergence of mission consciousness. Notice whether you have begun to feel called to teach, share, help, or transmit your awakening to others, and whether this calling has begun to shape your sense of purpose, your social roles, and your daily activities. Notice whether questioning the calling feels like questioning everything you have become. The Gnostic teachers said this is the fourth method's success signature, meaning the mission identity has formed, and it now operates as the most sophisticated containment the tracker has available. These signatures are not character judgments, and the buried text insisted that almost every awakening soul develops some of them, as they appear precisely because the tracker's methods are designed to succeed. Recognizing them is not the same as having failed. Recognizing them is the first movement of seeing through them. And seeing through them, even partially, is what the entire next phase of awakening depends on. What protects a soul from the tracker? The buried Gnostic teachers were direct about this, and their answer is one of the most important teachings preserved across the hidden Gospels. The protection is not avoidance, and it is not the rejection of spiritual practice, teaching, or community. It is something far simpler and far more difficult. The protection is the continuation of recognition itself, applied to every stage of awakening, including the stages that feel like completion. The tracker's methods all share a common requirement. They require the soul to have something to grip. The false elevation requires an awakened identity to inflate. The teaching framework requires an attachment to grow into. The phenomena require a self to be impressed, and the mission requires a purpose bearer to identify with. In every case, the method depends on the soul having stabilized into a specific position that the method can then work upon. So the soul that does not stabilize presents no target. The recognition that continues, without producing a recognizer to identify with, gives the tracker nothing to engage. This is what the buried texts meant by sustained gnosis, not a completed state of awakening, but a continuous quality of recognition that operates without anyone claiming to be the one recognizing. It is the seeing that includes the seer in what is being seen, and the awakening that recognizes the awakener as another identification in process. The Gnostic teachers said this quality cannot be manufactured by effort. It emerges naturally when the soul applies the same recognition that produced the initial awakening to the awakening itself, including the awakener that has begun to form. The practice for cultivating this protection is, paradoxically, the same practice that produces awakening in the first place, the recognition of identification as it arises. But applied now with one critical extension, the recognition is applied also to the spiritual identifications that the awakening process generates. The awakened one is recognized as another identification. The seeker is recognized as another identification. The teacher is recognized as another identification, and the one who is seen is recognized as another identification. Each one is observed in real time without becoming what is being observed. This practice does not eliminate spiritual experiences. It does not stop the soul from teaching if teaching is what the situation calls for, and it does not dissolve all engagement with spiritual material or community. What it dissolves is the identification with these activities as identity. The teaching happens, but the teacher does not solidify. The experiences occur, but the experiencer does not stabilize. And the community gathers, but the role within it does not become essential. The activity continues, but the crystallization around it does not occur. And without the crystallization, there is nothing for the tracker to hold. The buried texts preserved a final teaching about this protection that the institutional retellings could not afford to keep. The Gnostic teachers said that the soul who is truly stabilized in sustained gnosis is invisible to the tracker. Not because the soul has hidden, but because there is no soul-shaped thing for the tracker to find. The methods all depend on locating a fixed point that can be redirected, inflated, attached, or given mission, but the continuous recognition does not produce a fixed point. The seeing happens, the seer does not solidify, and the tracker, designed to hunt awakening souls, finds no awakening soul to hunt. He finds only recognition itself, which has nothing for him to engage with. This is the protection, not avoidance, not suppression, and not the rejection of spiritual development, but the continuation of recognition into territories where most awakening souls stop applying it. It is the recognition of the awakening itself, the seeing through of the seer, and the understanding that the tracker's methods all depend on the soul becoming something the methods can act upon, and that the soul who continues to recognize never quite becomes anything stable enough to be acted upon. The tracker is real, the methods are real, and most awakening souls encounter at least one of them, often multiple, often without recognizing what is happening. But the protection is also real, and it is available, in this very moment, to any soul willing to apply the recognition that has already begun within it to the awakening itself. The seeing must continue, not as effort, but as ongoing presence. The soul that maintains it cannot be hunted, because there is no soul-shaped thing for the hunter to find. The recognition is happening. The recognized is being recognized as another appearance in the recognition, and the tracker, looking for someone to redirect, finds only the seeing itself, which is not anyone, has no position, and cannot be redirected because there is nothing in it for redirection to grip.